I could probably ask this of the entire panel. I'll start with you, Mr. Rundy. One of the things I'm fascinated by in general is supply chains, right? And the fact that our supply chains in this country are deeply dependent on locations in the Asia-Pacific region for a lot of different reasons. And it strikes me that if we had some of these supply chains, obviously in the United States preferably, but not, if not in the U.S., in the Western Hemisphere, it would have a dual purpose. First, it would create some diversity, and therefore we wouldn't see some of the container backlogs. There'd be other ports that'd be available to take some of this. And second, it would solve a lot of the sort of socioeconomic issues in some of these countries. In essence, I know the answer, okay, but I'm not sure. But I imagine a world in which Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, were countries that had vibrant manufacturing sectors, downscale in the production, but that created stable employment for young people so they wouldn't have to leave their countries. I get rule of law and other things of that nature become a problem in many of these places. In particular, as I look at Pfizer designating factories in China as the main manufacturer of vaccines for the greater region, that includes Taiwan, you can only imagine how that would be used. And third, because I think we're entering an era that I think is going to be, best way to say it is biomedical nationalism. There are plenty of countries around the world that have gone through this and said, never again will we not have the inability to make oxygen, the inability to make PPE, the inability to make medicine, the inability to manufacture a vaccine, and our basic goods, because pandemics disrupt supply chains, but so potentially can geopolitical conflict. So in specific and then in general, in specific, why haven't we seen, and what can we do to make it more so that places like Pfizer, Moderna, and other pharmaceutical companies return or enter the Western Hemisphere as a place to manufacture? Obviously, it's a U.S. territory, but I mean, Puerto Rico is a logical place, and it's one that I deeply believe that we should reinstate and do everything we can in tax policy. But what more can we do to encourage that specifically when it comes to the pandemic, and then more broadly in general in the region on other topics? And I know this. I know these countries have to do a lot, but what can we do to make the region more attractive in both the short and long term for this? And I'll start with you, Mr. Rundy, but I open it up to the whole panel.
Thank you, Senator. This is one of the key questions of the COVID pandemic. I've done 1,500 Zoom calls since March the 12th, 2020, and so have you, Senator. And one of my deep thoughts is that we're going to get a partial economic divorce from China. Maybe they can visit with their spouse and they can bring their new spouse to Thanksgiving, and maybe we can sit together at graduation for the kids. But we're going to have a very different kind of relationship with mainland China going forward. And so I think I want to call it a silver lining, but perhaps it's a...
By the way, that's not just us.
Yeah. Everybody. I think everyone's going to get a partial economic divorce from China.
China plus one.
Yeah. China.
Look
right,
for
they can bring right to the blended family holiday picture. You get the idea, Senator. I think the point is I think that there are a number of steps. We're going to move from a just-in-time supply chain world to a just-in-case supply chain world. I don't think anybody in this room ever wants to depend on mainland China ever again for PPEs, pills, ventilators. When they started making threats about we're going to cut you off, those are fighting words. And so I think that was a wake-up call. So I think there's several things we could do specifically, and you, the senators, could do. Ecuador wants a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. Uruguay wants a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. Brazil would like a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. We ought to also fulfill the promise of CAFTA-DR. We haven't fully seen that happen. I think we have an opportunity at the Summit of the Americas to put some concrete things on the table. So I think one of the opportunities will be to ask the Biden-Harris administration, what are you doing in the aspects of trade to enable some of these things? I also think we ought to be using our foreign aid to grease the skids of some of these shifts in global supply chains. Japan is doing this. They're providing $1 billion to have Japanese companies move their factories from mainland China to, say, Southeast Asia. In theory, Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean could be, and Colombia and Brazil could be net winners of sort of these global shifts in supply chains. So some of it are trade agreements, some of it's about foreign aid. I think we ought to continue to have a constructive dialogue with the government of Mexico. I think, in theory, Mexico ought to be a net winner of some of these shifts in global supply chains. And then finally, on Puerto Rico, I absolutely agree with you, Senator. We ought to revisit some of those tax agreements that I guess went away in the 1990s. We ought to look at that. I know Governor Fortunio is someone who's very knowledgeable about these issues and be someone who I would be consulting about the details of it. I think you put your finger on something very important, Senator. Thank you.
Senator Rubio, helping Latin American and Caribbean countries strengthen their manufacturing capacity and helping transfer mRNA technology, which definitely the mRNA vaccines are the superior vaccines. And those are the US government can do so much to facilitate that technology transfer from Pfizer and Moderna. And those strengthening also local laboratories could have a great impact for the current pandemic and also for preparedness for future pandemics, and definitely would answer a lot of your concerns regarding the lack of employment opportunities and all the factors that trigger migration to the United States. So definitely strengthening the local production, strengthening public health systems, and because what has happened throughout the region, in most countries, not in all, is that essential health services have been disrupted because of the COVIDization, as they say in Latin America, la COVIDización, and of the health systems. So everything else, for example, people give birth every day, and a lot of women have been unable to give birth in a good quality setting because of the way that COVID has overtaken a lot of the health services. So definitely strengthening local capacity to be able to respond better now and in the future. It's the best thing that the United States government can do. Thank you.